The minimum wage in most states across the country is $7.25. However, with the current state of the fragile economy, many low-wage workers have to also rely on governmental assistance while working long hours. Frustration by workers during the holiday season led to a strike by megastore Walmart workers and was followed by fast food workers in New York City. We stopped by a recent demonstration here in the heart of New York City's Times Square and talked to protesters to see what they wanted and find out why the ongoing strikes. We'll bring you that on this week's show. But it's also safe to note that 17 states currently have a minimum wage set higher than the federal standard. And a number of states are considering giving their lowest paid workers another raise. Now, supporters of increasing the minimum wage compared a minimum wage boost to a stimulus action. We'll tell you what that means and possibly offer some solutions on this week's show. Do join us. First, it was the nationwide protest at Walmart stores on Black Friday as employees staged a walkout, complaining that Walmart pays low wages and sets unfair labor conditions. Shortly after came the New York strike by hundreds of fast food workers as they walked out and called for better wages and unionization. Being part of the union would raise their wages from the current $7.25 to $15. It was the industry's biggest strike in history. What followed has been a set of almost weekly demonstrations from low-paying workers around the country. At a recent rally in the heart of New York's Times Square, hundreds gathered and once again called for higher wages and better working conditions.
A person who is working minimum wage, supporting their family, is not even going to, in the New York City area for the most part, is not going to be able to pay for their rent, which is very high here, and food costs. Not to mention healthcare, education. That really leads to a horrible set of conditions. Now, if you compare them to the conditions of workers who are building Apple products or building stuff for Walmart in China, we have it nowhere near as bad. But nonetheless, the basics, the cost of living here is much higher. And so you have people who are struggling to get by in an economy where things are getting worse and worse.
The crowd mainly consisted of fast food restaurant workers like Wendy's, McDonald's, and Burger King, as well as supporters from the Occupy Wall Street movement and labor organizations.
They cannot continue to threaten us for wanting to unionize.
Yeah!
Porque estamos en nuestro derecho. Because it's our right.
Well, people are here demonstrating because we have a low-wage sector in the United States that have been massively exploited. McDonald's workers, Burger King workers, Walmart workers, etc. And they're beginning to walk out en masse in their hundreds and beginning to demand the right to a union, demand the right to a living wage. They're calling for $15 an hour as a living wage.
And at the end of the day, when everybody go home, I want them to say the same thing. I made a change. Let me hear you say it. I made a change. I made a change. I made a change.
It's important that we raise the standard of living of the whole working class, of all workers. The problem is particularly acute for the insecure and low-wage workers at the massive restaurant enterprises like McDonald's or Wendy's.
While many union leaders came out in support of these workers and the majority of protesters embraced the union backing, a few participants expressed skepticism about what they called union bureaucracy that may backfire.
Part of this is a representation of the union bureaucracy, understanding that they have to mobilize a show of actually being behind these workers. But the fact is the union bureaucracy doesn't want to fight for these workers. What they want to do is they want to be partners of the bosses. They want dues-paying members. They want these people to be unionized with no real gain in wages. They want to tell these workers that they're real friends of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party is one of our greatest enemies because it actually tells workers they're on their side when they're actually leading the attacks. The struggles can't be isolated like they are. The reason why we're losing is because they're isolated struggles that don't raise class-wide demands that unite us. We're not fighting for jobs for all. We're not fighting for an end to the attacks on all of us. What we're fighting for is our own little sector, our own little piece of the pie. And as long as we continue to do that, we're going to continue to think we have a stake in a system that's not meant to support us, that's meant to attack us.
Workers that are not part of the union in the United States can't stage an official strike without the possibility of losing their jobs. But these men and women say that's a risk they're willing to take. The majority of the workers rely on public assistance to get by today's fragile economy, while also having to work long hours.
It's interesting that in the U.S. right now, the place where it's come out more has been with workers who are at the bottom. Walmart workers, fast food workers here in New York have walked out, gone out on strike, even though they're not unionized, which is a really unprecedented thing. And so we are seeing a response from the left and the labor community here.
A university student, Justin Wooten, has been working in the fast food industry almost all his working life and recalls how he walked out on his first 2 jobs because of bad working conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I got my first job when I was 17. I was at an Arby's, and I worked there for about 2 weeks before I just got really fed up with it. One of my coworkers was right nasty to me, so I just walked off the job in the middle of the shift. You know, they just don't pay people enough money to put up with this crap. I got another job at a Burger King, which I worked for about 6-7 months before I finally quit. It was more interesting. I mean, it's just not very good work. You never know when you're coming in. They're always wanting to change your schedule. There's nothing consistent about it. And it's low pay. I was doing something on the side that was making so much more money. So I'd be at my job and I'd be thinking, wow, I can make more money just doing something for myself than standing here. You know?
But I asked him, what about those that don't have the opportunity to do something on the side? How do they get by?
Oh, everybody there did have some sort of government assistance. And some of the people there have been working there for a very long time, literally 15 years. And these were people there in their 50s and 60s, you know, people who should have had different careers and are retired by then or something like that. And they were stuck at these essentially dead-end jobs. The manager I had at that time was actually sexually harassing the employees, and he eventually got fired for a sexual harassment lawsuit. But he just ended up at another fast food chain managing somewhere else.
With a patchy economy, low-wage jobs have become more prevalent, and Justin believes that's the reason unions have decided to take action and finally support these workers.
Well, I think the unions are finally starting to realize there's potential in a lot of jobs they've wrote off before as being low skill, low wage, temporary work. The unions are starting to see you know, that's becoming more and more people's daily life. They have no future, so it's young workers are stuck in a lot of these jobs. And to go to the young workers and actually increase the size of their union and unionize more of the workforce in America, they're going to have to go to these low-wage jobs because, you know, in America, that's what everything's turned into.
Tia, who preferred not to give her last name, had a similar experience. She started working at a minimum wage job a few years ago at $7.15 an hour as a student.
Yeah, my first couple of jobs actually were cashier. My second one was fast food, and it was minimum wage, and that was when minimum wage was $7.15 an hour a few years ago. And I was a student, and I was paying for books for college, and I had to pay bills. My parents brought me up since I was a young age, that I would start paying for my bills and become responsible. And at $7.15 an hour, it was really hard for me to do so. I also worked with people who were raising families. They were lower income. As a single person, trying to save up for myself, I couldn't even do it. I could not afford to go to the beach. I couldn't afford. It was all going towards school books. And, you know, that's expensive alone. And I'm just me. I'm not even trying to raise a family right now.
Today, her main income comes from babysitting, a job she prefers over working at any chain restaurant.
Even though I was making money when I was working, I knew I had a schedule, I was miserable. It's cause for anxiety and depression under that state. You're dealing with people that just don't understand. You know, the customers are rude. You're dealing with bosses. I enjoy babysitting because I enjoy being around kids. I feel more respected. It's just something I prefer. It's good for my mental health and for my physical health as well.
Caleb Maupin from the International Action Center came out to support the protesters and says instead of putting our energy into bringing jobs back to the U.S., low-wage jobs at home should be turned into high-paying work.
during the Democratic convention, Obama and Joe Biden talked a lot about, oh, we need to bring good-paying industrial jobs back to the United States. But, you know, industry has not always been a high-paying thing. It's because of the unions. There was mass labor organizing in those fields. And so instead of that, what we need right now in fast food is not for jobs to come back to replace fast food. We need to turn the fast food, just like any other thing, into high-paying jobs.
Stephanie Luce is an associate professor at the Murphy Institute, City University of New York. She tells me that earlier demonstrations set the ground for the latest string of protests.
And I would say that it's actually not quite as recent as that, because we actually saw some of the Walmart warehouse workers striking earlier this fall, right around the time that the Chicago Teachers Union was striking. So I think these actions are kind of tied up in a general growing sense of outrage about our economic, conditions, which is that we had this economic crisis in 2008. Many people are telling us the economy is better, but things are just as bad for low-wage workers. And we're starting to see the increase in profits, increase in managerial bonuses, benefits at the top, but things at the bottom continue to stagnate and really be quite miserable.
The minimum wage is a cornerstone of the United States labor system and has been a cutting-edge labor law topic among employers and workers alike for decades. However, the United States hasn't always had a minimum wage. Before the minimum wage was introduced during the Great Depression of the 1930s, there was no national minimum wage, or indeed any legislation to protect workers from exploitation. Because of this lack of regulation, tens of thousands of workers were routinely exploited in sweatshops and factories, forced to work in horrible conditions and for pennies a week. Early attempts by labor unions to create a mandatory minimum wage were ruled unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court on the grounds that they, quote, restricted the worker's right to set the price for his own labor. This allowed employers to continue exploiting their workers through the Great Depression, when incredible demands for a job caused wages to drop even further to an all-time low. With poverty becoming a huge national issue, President Franklin D. Roosevelt promised to constitutionally protect American workers as a key part of his 1936 re-election campaign. After winning the historical 1936 election by a landslide, President Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, today known as FLSA, into law in early 1938.
We associate industrial work with higher wages. We associate people who work in factories, people who have skilled trades with higher wages, and that's kind of a fallacy, because until about the Great Depression, that wasn't the case. People made very low wages in those industries, but there was a great organizing campaign. And during the 1930s, I believe in 1934, there were 3 cities that were shut down by general strikes. Minneapolis, Toledo, Ohio, and San Francisco were all shut down by general strikes. There was a huge union campaign, and Roosevelt was forced by a mass movement in the streets to offer some concessions.
This is about who can afford to live in New York.
Well, yeah, until 1938, we did not have a federal minimum wage. A few states had state minimum wages starting in 1910. But what it did was to really establish a floor by which theoretically employers could not go below. And the reality is, in this kind of economy, in a so-called free market, we always have more workers than we have jobs. And if we were really left it to market forces, the market forces would drive wages down to the very bottom levels. That's particularly true when we don't have a social safety net. We've dismantled welfare programs, we've dismantled, we've really decreased the food stamps program. We have very little protections at the bottom. So what a minimum wage does is try to establish some basic floor so that we have at least workers, meeting the basic subsistence needs.
The FLSA introduced sweeping regulations to protect American workers from being exploited and created a mandatory federal minimum wage of 25 cents an hour in order to maintain a minimum standard of living necessary for health, efficiency, and general well-being without substantially curtailing employment. In addition to establishing a mandatory nationwide minimum wage, the Fair Labor Standards Act introduced many other workers' protection laws still in effect today, including banning child labor and establishing workplace safety statuses. The heyday of the minimum wage was in the late 1960s, when the wage was high enough relative to the cost of living to provide a secure income. Since then, it's risen slowly but surely to $7.25 an hour, which adds up to $15,080 a year for a full-time employee. However, even though the dollar amount has increased, the real value has not really kept in pace with inflation, as you see in this graph.
So when the United States passed its federal minimum wage in 1938, it was 25 cents an hour. But there was no logic to that. It was really just a political maneuvering, and it did not establish a formula that the minimum wage should meet a certain basic cost of living, and it did not include automatic increases with inflation. So what that means is to raise the minimum wage takes an act of Congress, and we've seen that happen for a while. Congress was kind of keeping up the minimum wage to be closer to a basic subsistence level. In the last 30 years, it's only raised the minimum wage 3 times. And as a result, the minimum wage has fallen far below the federal poverty line and has not kept pace with inflation. The rate, if it had kept pace with inflation since the 60s, it would be about $10.55 an hour today. And interestingly enough, if the minimum wage had kept pace with the growth in CEO salaries, the minimum wage today would be about $23 an hour. So it's far below the value of what workers themselves are producing, and it's also below its historic levels.
When the minimum wage was established, for the wage to be the equivalent of what it was at that point with inflation, I believe it would have to be like $15 to even be anywhere near equivalent to what it was at the time it was established. People can't survive. I mean, $7.25. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, people can't. I mean, that's an outrageous. I mean, people can't. You can't live on that, especially not in New York City. There's been campaigns. In 2006, the Democrats, in their congressional campaign, used it as a way to get low-income people out to vote for them. In many states, they had initiatives on the ballot to raise the minimum wage. I know Nancy Pelosi talked a lot about that, and that was one way the Democrats were able to take Congress, was with minimum wage initiatives that were on the ballot in many states, and they did in 2006. Yeah, it was a sweep, and they used minimum wage initiatives to get low-income people who tend to vote Democrat more often, but also are not as likely to go out and vote. You know, they use that to get people on the ballot, and I mean that was a step forward, because I mean, who's going to vote? Who's not going to vote to raise their own wages?
Maupin says a higher minimum wage not only benefits the individual earner, but helps the economy at large by increasing consumerism.
If you have more money, you will spend more money, and people with low wages spend the money they have. People with higher wages, you know, the wealthy, they tend to, you know, keep their money. They tend to, you know, kind of hoard it or only invest it in a way to make more money. But people with low income, they tend to spend every penny they've got in order to survive. So that money that would be paid in higher wages to low-wage workers, that money would go directly into the economy and solve the problem. We're dealing with a glut of overproduction. Workers are also consumers. Working class people, they sell their labor power, and then they buy the commodities that are produced. And if their wages are low enough, they can't buy back the products. And that's the death, the built-in self-destruction within the capitalist system, is this, you know, this problem. People can never buy back the products they make. Workers are consumers, and they can't buy back the products, and that's the problem we're facing. And you know, they try with credit cards to make it so people spend money they don't have to buy things. They've tried all kinds of schemes to keep the system still going, but inevitably capitalism can't get over that single flaw, you know, of overproduction.
I'm making $7.25. I've been working fast food since I was 16. I'm 22. I got 3 kids. I maintain a 4.0 GPA and still no change. And my kids deserve better. I'm tired of looking at $7.25. I want that 15 so I can sit and relax and decide to go on vacation.
Yeah, and this was actually kind of the motivation behind the initial minimum wage in 1938. The problem is when you have wages driven down to their very subsistence levels, you don't get the kind of things that you need to make an economy grow, which is consumer spending, savings, money available for investment. You really don't have that pot of money that's needed to stimulate an economy. The economic thinking of that time was a minimum wage would in fact inject money into the lower levels of the economy among low-wage workers who spend that money locally. And that's what people call it a multiplier effect, which is you inject money locally and it creates new demand and new jobs. That idea seems to have fallen out of favor among certain policymakers today, and they have instead promoted giving money to business owners or CEOs, saying they're the job creators, when in fact it's low-wage workers and they're spending locally that is often the job creator.
As the debate continues over whether the federal minimum wage is truly a fair living wage, labor activists call on Congress to raise minimum wage, while others point out the negative effects this could have on the economy. they argue that it will put too great of a strain on employers concerned with keeping costs down, which will ultimately lead to companies being forced to slash jobs to stay afloat.
Well, increasing the minimum wage would end up helping everyone because all wages in a way are based on minimum wage. The minimum wage is the lowest, and so then jobs are kind of ranked according to how close they are to the lowest wage. So it would really make everyone's wages go up in the long term. And the other factor involved in that, they always say, oh, you know, it'll increase inflation. That's one argument you hear is, oh, it'll just make the prices will be inflated if that's the case. But really, that's not the case. What we're fighting over, we're not fighting over how much people spend when they go to the counter. What we're fighting over is the profits in the hands of the rich. I mean, you know, for a soda you get at any fast food, you know, that costs about 3 cents, including the cup for the McDonald's to make that soda, right? The rest of it all goes to profits and wages and things like that. The actual cost of the product is, I mean, soda especially, it's like 3 cents.
And contrary to what many people believe, most low-wage workers aren't employed by small businesses or mom-and-pop operations that would suffer due to minimum wage hikes. A huge majority of the low-wage employees are from large corporations that have enjoyed healthy profits during a sluggish economy. Now, this is according to a new report issued in July 2012. The report, put out by the National Employment Law Project, found that 2/3 of America's low-wage workers work for companies with more than 100 employees, such as Walmart, McDonald's, and Yum Brands, parent companies of Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, and KFC. Looking at the 50 largest employers of low-wage workers, more than 90% were profitable last year, meaning that they're unlikely to be in a position where raising the minimum wage to a living wage would significantly affect their ability to retain the same number of employees.
But in this economy, often people in these low-wage jobs are in competition with people who've been laid off from higher-paying jobs as those jobs were eliminated. I know when I was in Cleveland, I knew many former auto workers who worked in pizza shops because they'd been laid off in the auto plants. And these are people who once were making a good $25 an hour, are now competing with young people for minimum wage jobs. And that's a very scary situation. We're not in a situation where minimum wage jobs are for teenagers at this point. We're in a situation where minimum wage jobs, there's even high competition for minimum wage jobs. You know, there's for every job available, there's 5 people seeking a job at this point. So there's mass unemployment in this country right now. So any job is a gain.
According to Luce, the fluctuation of the minimum wage is political rather than being based on a formula.
Well, it really is a political issue in the United States. Some other countries set their minimum wage by a formula, so it's set by maybe a commission or a formula as like relation to average housing costs. In the United States, it's purely political. So it's gone up in times when the labor movement has had more power, when unions and workers' organizations have been able to have political leverage, and it's stagnated in recent years as the labor movement has less power. What it's meant was in the last 30 years, we've seen a real increase in working poverty. So 40 years ago, when we talked about poverty, we were mostly talking about people without jobs at all or senior citizens. Today, when we talk about poverty, we're also talking about a lot of people who have jobs and even sometimes full-time jobs, and yet they're living below the federal poverty line.
And then there is the issue of cost of living from state to state.
If we used a basic formula today, just took government data on a fair market housing, what's the very minimum food costs, minimum healthcare costs, and so forth, we would actually be at a minimum wage so far above what we have now that no one seems to think that's politically feasible. In a city like New York, it'd be more like $25 an hour or $30 an hour. We're just far below what we need. So to get it back to that kind of formula, we have a long way to go. Part of the challenge, too, is that we're never going to have the exactly right answer. Cost of living varies dramatically by state, by city, by region. Also, what you need to survive depends on your household type. Do you have children or not?
Even though President Obama campaigned in 2008 on the promise to raise the minimum wage, he has not been active in that fight for some time now. Despite the likely political standstill on the minimum wage issue, recent polls have shown that 70% of Americans support raising the minimum wage and believe that doing so has the power to help the economy in these uncertain times.
You know, this area is one of those fascinating disconnects between what we know from the economic research and what voters want on the one hand and what policymakers are doing on the other hand. The research shows that raising the minimum wage does not lead to job loss. There's been a little bit of, there's been debate about that, but the overwhelming research shows that it doesn't cause job loss across the board. And in fact, many notable economists, Nobel Prize winners, are calling for an increase to the minimum wage. We also see that voters of both parties, even sometimes Tea Party voters, support raising the minimum wage. However, we continue to get this from both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party that we cannot raise the minimum wage. They said that when the economy was strong, they said that when the economy was weak. They tend to say that no matter what. And it's a real tragedy because it's actually a way to stimulate the economy, and they're claiming that it will hurt the economy.
No music! 15 in the union! No music! 15 in the union! And at the end of the day, when everybody go home, I want them to say the same thing. I made a change.
Well, if people have wages, they will be spending their wages, and that goes into the economy. But the biggest thing, though, with regards to Obama and unemployment, Franklin Roosevelt got rid of a big chunk of unemployment with the stroke of a pen when he signed the Works Progress Administration into effect. That was a government jobs program which built all the roads in the suburbs, which built most of the major bridges around the country, which put the art in the post offices, which paved roads everywhere. It built things, and that was a jobs program where the government, instead of spending money to bail out the banks, put people to work, gave people work. The Works Progress Administration. There was also, the National Theater Project. There were all kinds of projects in which the government gave people employment when the private sector couldn't do it. And if Obama wanted to create employment, instead of trying to create incentives for companies to hire people, he could go and just do it. It could be done. I mean, Roosevelt did it with the Works Progress Administration. It can be done.
We deserve better. We deserve better. I'm not settling for less. Give me my 15 in the union. I worked hard for it. Same way all these people out here can stand up and fight for what they believe in. The same way they could get off their chair and fix those mistakes that they made and correct the issues that's going on today. We want our 15 in the union, and we want it now.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Inside Out. Thanks so much for staying with us and watching. Remember, you can always send me your emails to insideout@susanmadaris.com. I'm always looking forward to them. You can also follow me on Twitter for latest updates and discussions. Until next week in another show, goodbye.